Welcome to lecture number 85. This is historical topic 8.2, the Cold War from 1945 to 1980, and the theme is America in the World. The one learning objective is explain the continuities and changes in Cold War policies from 1945 to 1980. There are a lot of fluctuations in Cold War policy throughout this period, and a lot of it has to do with who is president and who is the premier of the Soviet Union. Some will take a harder stance against the other, and others will try to de-escalate tensions. The first key concept is broken up into two parts, and the first part says policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence. These two goals to limit communist military powers and their ideological influence are reflected in the following events. After World War II, Germany and its capital, Berlin, were split up into four occupation zones. East Germany and East Berlin were under the control of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet German zone and the neighboring Eastern European countries, the Soviet Union still had a military presence that was left over from the end of the war. East Germany was allowed to hold elections, but most of the candidates that ran were Soviet-friendly politicians. The Western zones were eventually allowed to merge and elect a free democratic government to counter the growing Soviet influence in the East. George Kennan was an American diplomat in Moscow who wrote back to the State Department via an 8,000-word telegram. Hence the name Long Telegram. Kennan described the Soviet policy as being aggressive and the Soviet view of the world as contrarian, in which they believed there was an inevitable conflict to come between them and the United States and other capitalist countries. Kennan advised that the U.S. needed to counter this by matching that aggressiveness, or showing that the U.S. would not give in to Soviet aggression across the world. He suggested the U.S. adopt a policy of containment to keep communism from spreading into other parts of the world without overthrowing the communist regimes that already existed. President Truman agreed with Kennan's advice and implemented the Truman Doctrine. This was a policy that promised support to any country that was trying to keep communism from infiltrating their country. This can be seen as a continuity in the expansion of the U.S.'s intervention abroad, namely the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt Corollary on the Monroe Doctrine. Truman's policy was prompted by a communist-led insurgency in Greece that attempted to overthrow the government. The U.S. sent $400 million of aid to Greece and neighboring Turkey to stabilize their economy and restore some legitimacy and confidence in those governments. The National Security Act that passed in 1947 created the National Security Council. It reshuffled the cabinet and intelligence agencies in the United States government. The Department of War was converted into the Department of Defense, the CIA was formally established, and it became the first peacetime intelligence agency. Previously, intelligence agencies like the OSS were only active during wars, but now communism was perceived as a constant threat that needed to be monitored, even during peacetime. It was also a response to Soviet spying efforts. Americans needed to keep eyes on those people who might possibly be spies. The National Security Council had the heads of all these organizations in one place to advise the president on national security concerns. In 1950, the NSC put out a report titled NSC 68. It was about a 60-page document that became the blueprint for the U.S. for militarization and buildup of defenses and arms during the Cold War. This is why the U.S. increased spending in the military-industrial complex during the Cold War, to posture a strong presence against the Soviet Union. So to fulfill the goal of limiting the military power of the Soviet Union and communism around the world, the U.S. increased their own military capabilities. The second part of this key concept covers the last goals of policymakers during the Cold War. That was to create a free market global economy and build an international security system. To create a free market global economy, the U.S. co-founded the World Bank to fund the reconstruction in countries that had been ravaged by World War II. They gave loans and grants for investments and projects for infrastructure, education, and healthcare. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was created to oversee the balance of payments and financial crises around the world. Access to capital from these institutions reduced the amount of poverty in developing countries and kept the threat of communism from arising. The issue of balance of payments was important given the history of World War I. During the interwar period, Germany was supposed to continue paying reparations to France and Britain. During the Great Depression, Germany stopped making payments, and the Dawes Plan that had been established by the U.S. collapsed, hurting all countries involved. To accomplish the goal of building international security, the United States joins NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a military alliance for collective security. That means that if one of the NATO countries is attacked, then the other NATO countries will come to their defense. It's mostly Western European countries in the United States. 12 countries joined in its founding in 1949, and then it will later grow to 30 countries in the present day. The Soviet Union counters NATO with its own military alliance in the form of the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, or the Eastern Bloc, made up this alliance. It divided Europe into two, East and West. The impact is seen on the map on the screen. The black line that runs between Germany and Central Europe and between the Soviet Union and Finland is referred to as the Iron Curtain. This term was coined by Winston Churchill in a speech in the United States. He drew attention to the stark differences between the two systems on either side of the Iron Curtain. He pointed out that democracy and freedom were not widespread behind the Iron Curtain, and that's why the Western countries needed to be as strong as they could to counter any communist aggression. The next key concept says, as post-war tensions dissolved the wartime alliance between Western democracies and the Soviet Union, the United States developed a foreign policy based on collective security, international aid, and economic institutions that bolstered non-communist nations. Notice how this learning objective is really similar to the last one. Some of the US actions previously talked about will be repeated in this slide, though it will add other pieces of evidence that can be used to support each part of the claim. Under collective security, the founding of the UN is added. At the Yalta Conference of 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed to join a multinational organization to replace the defunct League of Nations. The San Francisco Conference in October 1945 laid out the charter for the new organization. One of the main founding principles of the UN is to maintain international peace and security, as well as promoting economic and social progress. The Security Council is the organ of the UN meant to maintain international peace by bringing the world's strongest military powers together to solve problems diplomatically. The military alliances of NATO and Warsaw Pact show up again as a way to ensure collective security. Another addition to this goal is the pursuit of the hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb. It was about 100 times more powerful than the blast that went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A picture of it is in the bottom left. The successful detonation of the H-bomb signaled to the Soviet Union that the US was not going to back down in the buildup of military power. International aid from the US is dispensed through several programs and policies. The slides covered earlier how Greece and Turkey received up to $400 million in aid as part of the Truman Doctrine. The Marshall Plan of 1948 built on that same rationale. If the US sent money, food, and supplies needed for European countries to complete their recovery from the war, they would stave off the threat of communism taking hold. The plan was named after Secretary of State George Marshall, and it ultimately transferred over $13 billion in economic recovery programs. Those were examples of aid to preempt the dangers of communism. In 1948, the borders across eastern and western Germany that led to the city of Berlin were blockaded by the Soviet Union in response to the introduction of the Deutschmark. The Soviet Union perceived this to be a part of a larger plan to create a unified West Germany. The city of Berlin became inaccessible to the Western Allied powers. This was problematic because the city of Berlin also had American, British, and French occupation zones, so West Berliners were left without supplies or access to food. The US was unwilling to escalate tensions by trying to bypass the road blockades, so they turned to the air. The Berlin airlift delivered nearly 12,000 tons of supplies daily, and American and British planes took more than 250,000 total trips over the course of the nearly 1 year that it lasted. The Soviets finally lifted the blockade in 1949. Finally, the economic institutions of the IMF and the World Bank were covered in the previous slide. The policy of containment is covered more deeply in the next key concept. Concerned by expansionist communist ideology and Soviet repression, the United States sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including major military engagements in Korea. This policy of containment was to try and stop the spread of communism without starting a full-on war, especially one with the Soviet Union. However, there were wars that were fought to try and contain communism, but more often than not, the United States was just sending supplies and money to the forces battling communism. These are called proxy wars because the United States was not directly fighting against the Soviet Union. The main example for this is in China, where a civil war was being waged between communist and nationalist forces from 1945 to 1949. Mao Zedong was the leader of communist forces, and Chiang Kai-shek led the nationalist democratic forces. The US sent money and supplies to Chiang Kai-shek and his troops, but eventually the communists pushed him out of mainland China and set up a government in the island of Taiwan. Building on the policy of containment, there was a fear that if one country fell to communism, then other neighboring countries would also fall to communism. In 1954, President Eisenhower vocalized this as the falling domino principle, and has since been known as the domino theory. If one domino falls, then it causes the chain reaction in which the dominoes around it fall as well. The United States thought that if they could hold one domino from falling, then all the other ones would also be saved. This key concept specifically points out the military engagements in Korea. North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, launched an attack on South Korea in June of 1950. North Korean troops pushed South Korean troops all the way down to the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. The United States lobbied the United Nations to approve a military force to help South Korea push the North Korean troops back. The American general Douglas MacArthur from the island-hopping campaign of World War II led these United Nations forces to repel the North Korean advance. But MacArthur goes overboard and pushes the North Korean troops beyond the original border at the 38th parallel of latitude, nearly to the Chinese border. China, a freshly minted communist country, felt threatened to have foreign troops so close to their border, so they stepped in to help the North Koreans and pushed the UN forces back to the original border. In 1953, an armistice was signed between the two sides, and the border remains where it ended at the end of the fighting. As part of the armistice, neither side could militarize the border, so it is referred to as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. It is still the most closely watched border in the world since peace treaty was never formally agreed upon or signed. Today, North Korean defectors sometimes are able to get through the border, but landmines left over from the war make it one of the most dangerous crossings in the world. The Vietnam War also falls under this category of military engagements to contain communism or to stop the domino effect. However, there's an entire lecture devoted to this topic, so it won't be covered at length here. The last key concept says the Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct and indirect military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence, or détente. The policy of containment brought the United States into tense standoffs. In trying to present a strong posture against the other, the Soviet Union and the US often got sucked into a game of chicken. It happened earlier with the Berlin blockade, but the Soviet Union took a big swing by blockading the roads to the city of Berlin from West Germany. Then the US defied the Soviet blockade by airlifting supplies. Each action by either side could have just as well resulted in a military engagement between the two countries. This pattern of high-stakes foreign policy is called brinkmanship. It's called this because the United States was edging to the very brink of war to deter communist expansion. The presidency of John F. Kennedy was filled with instances like this. Shortly after JFK was inaugurated in 1961, the CIA presented to him a plan developed under the Eisenhower administration to sponsor an overthrow of the communist Cuban regime. The operation was called the Bay of Pigs Operation, named after the landing spot of where the CIA would drop off Cuban defectors who had been armed by the US to lead a democratic revolution against the communist leader Fidel Castro. JFK signed off on the operation, but it turned out to be a huge disaster. The operation was carried out at night, but under the light of a full moon. Cuban troops spotted the defectors early and chased them into the hillsides of the landing site. Just 4 months later, in August 1961, the Soviet Union erected the Berlin Wall to stop movement of people out of the Eastern Bloc. The poor economic conditions in East Germany and East Berlin were causing people to seek new opportunities in the West. The Soviet Union saw this as a threat because the brain drain that was happening could hurt economic conditions even further. So the Soviet Union sent troops to make sure that no one could cross into West Berlin as the wall was being constructed. The wall stood for 28 more years and it would continue to be heavily guarded on the eastern side of the city. The Soviets were taking a risk because the US could have responded more forcefully to protect the freedom of the people of East Germany. Kennedy responded by increasing the buildup of US military forces and nuclear missiles in the region, though ultimately decided that this wasn't going to be the confrontation that the US would use to declare war against the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Kennedy tried to use the wall in his speeches to highlight the downfalls of communism. He said that it was not only an offense against history, but a monument to the failures of the communist system. The final instance of brinkmanship is the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the fall of 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba spotted construction material and things that looked like nuclear warheads and ballistic missiles in Cuba. Further reconnaissance showed that the Soviet Union was indeed building a missile launch site in Cuba. President Kennedy called on the Soviets in Cuba to stop construction of this military base and to return any sort of missiles or nuclear warheads that may already be on the island. There's a bit of denial on the part of the Soviet Union and Cuba at first, but ultimately an attempt to defend the construction of a site so close to the US territory. The US themselves had earlier built a similar site in Turkey within striking distance of the Soviet Union. Either way, the US implemented a blockade on Cuba to stop any more Soviet shipments coming into the island and considered bombing the site if the Soviets would not capitulate. The Cuban base was already pretty far along in construction. Both sides basically had their finger on the button to launch a nuclear attack to the other, and at the very last moment, at the 11th hour, both sides backed off. Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, agreed to a deal with President Kennedy. Khrushchev would remove the missiles and the base from Cuba if the United States would later remove some of their missiles from Turkey. Kennedy looked like the hero, and Khrushchev was criticized at home for appearing weak against the Americans. Ultimately, he's replaced for his performance for a more hard-line premier. One positive thing that came out of this encounter was a newly established direct line of communication between both heads of states. Since both sides saw that they were so close to nuclear war and mutually assured destruction, they thought that the use of intermediaries for communication was dangerous. This brings on an easing of tensions in the 1960s and early 1970s between the US and the Soviet Union. The policy is called détente, for the French word relaxing. JFK starts negotiations for a nuclear test ban treaty that is signed a couple of months before his assassination. Johnson continued the trend with the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 to try and limit the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology. Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, had a more pragmatic approach called realpolitik. This means that he is less tied to a certain ideology and more likely to consider the real circumstances to advocate for U.S. interests. He's credited with a lot of the foreign policy victories of the Nixon presidency. He helps end the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and opens up relation to Communist China by recognizing Communist China as a legitimate government of China in order to get the Soviet Union to the negotiation table on other issues like arms limitations. SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. This aims to limit the number of anti-ballistic missiles and freeze the production of ballistic missiles by both countries. Despite this progress, the period of detente will start to fall apart at the end of the 1970s. After a second round of SALT negotiations and an agreement in principle, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan 6 months later. President Carter then revoked the treaty from the Senate consideration, and the 1980s kick off another period of the Cold War marked by more confrontational Soviet-American relations. Alright, that was it. Here is our recap. The United States tried to limit influence of communism around the world in the Cold War. After World War II, it created economic institutions and provided international aid in the form of the Marshall Plan, the IMF, and the World Bank. The containment policy prompted U.S. action in several countries across the world like Korea and Vietnam. At certain moments, the Cold War nearly became a hot war, like during the construction of the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis. A period of detente eased tensions between the USSR and the United States in 1980. And the Cold War will end, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. That's when the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. All of the countries that made up the Soviet Union become their own independent country. But as a result of Russia's interference in other countries' elections and invasions of sovereign countries, most recently Ukraine, it can be said that we are in a similar type of Cold War today, one that is ever increasing in its instances of brinkmanship. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.